Well, how is Ontario's economic update likely to be received on the financial pages of this province? Let us find out via FaceTime in Toronto with Vanmala Subramaniam. She is a reporter with the Financial Post. And in Montreal, Quebec via Skype, there's Daniel Tencer, who's a business editor at HuffPost Canada. Hi, you two. Nice to have you on tonight, virtually, if not around our studio table. Let's start, Vanmala, with you. What's the headline from the economic statement today, in your view?
Well, Steve, there were a couple of sensible things I thought. So, for one, just basic things like making sure there's no peak electricity rates for the next 45 days, deferring interest payments on student loans. Those were all good things. But the headline to me, I think, is the insufficiency of that 3.3 billion for healthcare spending, because we know with an aging population in this province, population growth for the last 7 to 8 years, that has been pretty dramatic. Our healthcare has been chronically underfunded. That's a stat that has been put out there by the Federal Finance Accountability Office. So I wonder if we see a surge in the number of COVID cases, insufficient ICU ventilators and hospital beds, and the length of time that this whole thing might go on for, beyond 6 months. I don't know if 3.3 billion is sufficient, and that would be what stands out for me.
Daniel, how about for you?
Well, I guess if I could exaggerate in headlines, I would say that my headline here is that the Doug Ford government is looking at this crisis through some very thick rose-colored glasses. You mentioned earlier that some of the assumptions in this fiscal update are pretty optimistic. For example, that we will end the year with an economy the same size as we had at the start of this year, 0% growth. That seems almost certainly not the case. Just this morning, TD Bank put out a report where they said that their optimistic scenario is that we end the year 4.4% down. That's for Canada as a whole, not for Ontario. But that assumes that we will get the economy going about mid-year, and we see a really strong rebound as business starts to open up again. That's a pretty big assumption. So for them to assume 0.0 is definitely rose-colored glasses. There are some other projections in there. For example, they expect that revenue will be about the same this year as last year. They were initially expecting a fairly large bump in revenue. Now they're saying that's not going to happen. And so instead, revenue is going to come in at about the same level as last year. Is that likely? So there's a lot here. And also, for example, the $10 billion in deferred taxes. The scenario they're giving us is that they are going to collect this money in September, halfway through the fiscal year. And presumably at the same time, they're going to start up regular tax collection again. So they're going to hit businesses with a double whammy of taxes in September, 6 months of back taxes and regular taxes, just as businesses are starting to pick up from this crisis. I really don't see that happening. So I would call this the optimistic scenario for how things are going to play out.
Okay, lots to follow up there from both of you. Vanmala, let me get you to follow up on the health issue. You did hear Rod Phillips, the finance minister, say today, this is our first shot out the gate. This isn't the last word on this subject. And in fact, he's put together, I think, nearly a $5 billion contingency fund once you add up the 3 different rainy day funds he's got going here, which means that he almost certainly expects to have to spend more money down the road, and it'll almost certainly be spent on healthcare. So does that not encourage you a bit?
It's slightly encouraging, I suppose, given the scale of the crisis. However, keep in mind that it took a pandemic for them to say this is how much we need to commit to healthcare, when we know for several years, even prior to the Ford government, healthcare spending in this province has been pretty insufficient. I think in a year there was a projection put out by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives that it takes about, we're lacking about 4.4 billion right now in the system. So this 3.3 billion you kind of need to add 4 to 5 billion more to that to make sure that we can get through the next 6 to 7 months. The other thing I wanted to point out that I think was severely lacking in the budget that people were really waiting for was any kind of mention of rent or mortgage, grace for people, so deferment of payments or forgiveness of payments or something like that, because I think many people have mentioned the April 1st rent deadline is coming up, and a lot of Ontarians cannot and will not have the money to pay if they have not been working for the last 2 weeks. So I think that was something that was lacking, and I am curious as to what the province is going to do about that, because I think we're going to see some pretty dramatic statistics come April 1st when it comes to rent and landlord-tenant disputes and things like that.
Well, parenthetically, I guess I should say that the Premier's already been on the record as saying no one's allowed to get thrown out of their place right now because they can't afford their rent, and the people who do that, the sheriffs who work for the province of Ontario, have been instructed not to evict anybody as long as this is going on. So that's a fair point, isn't it?
It is, but it's always about enforcement. It is very, very hard to actually make sure that tenants are not evicted. The other thing is I've been speaking for my articles to many gig workers, gig economy workers, self-employed people. And one of the things they tell me is some of them have mortgages. So they own a place, they have mortgages, they cannot afford to pay their mortgage. They've had reduced hours, for instance, of work, not totally off, but reduced hours. But they go to a bank, and because the banks evaluate them on a case-by-case basis, the banks say, hey, you're still employed, technically, you're still getting some money in. I don't know whether we can defer your mortgage payment yet. So there are all these situations that are very nuanced, where you just need someone to, in a way, come in and say, hey guys, for the next 3 to 4 months, don't worry about your rent and mortgage. And I think that will make Canadians, Ontarians feel a lot more reassured right now.
Daniel, help us understand who is in fact hurt more, or maybe most, when the kind of economic carnage we're seeing out there right now kicks in. Is it the smaller businesses or the bigger businesses?
I think almost certainly we're going to see the smaller businesses take an immediate hit. Small businesses tend to have low margins. They often, they operate hand to mouth, very much like households sometimes. So for a lot of them, there's not going to be a lot of a cushion there. They're not going to have a lot of time where the restaurant can sit empty, or where the garage can do no repairs of cars and that kind of thing. That's happening right now. In terms of the large corporations, we've seen a lot of impact to specific industries. We've seen a lot of impact on airlines and hotels, tourism, and so forth. Of course, those industries are practically shut down right now, but they also are better at getting government's attention. We have a long history of bailouts of large corporations and subsidies for major exporters and that kind of thing. So they're going to have the government's ear. I wonder about the small businesses. Those might have a harder time getting the government's attention in terms of support. For example, after the federal government brought out its latest update to their fiscal plans this morning.
Fair enough. But all right, sorry. Finish your point, and then I'll follow up on something.
Well, I was just going to say that a lot of business groups, after that update came out, put out some very alarmed press releases, basically saying, what about us? There's this robust $2,000 a month subsidy for workers, but what about the businesses themselves? So there's some tension there.
Okay, but if you look in the economic statement today, you do see that now 90% of the businesses in the province of Ontario are going to be forgiven paying their employer health tax over the next 6 months, and those are mostly small businesses. You see the Workers' Safety and Insurance Board premiums, what they used to call the Workers' Compensation Board. Those premiums are going to be on hold for 6 months. Small business got to like that. The obligation to pay your taxes over the next several months, again, a holiday on that. That's real relief, is it not?
In a sense, yes. But if you are a business and you're shut down and you're not making any revenue, if you're not making any income, you wouldn't really have been paying any taxes anyway. Your problem might be more like just surviving, making sure that the business is still there when the lockdown ends, making sure that you can pay your rent, and that you'll have employees that you'll be able to rehire when the time comes. So I think from the point of view of businesses, there's a lot of uncertainty there as to how they're actually literally physically going to get from here to there.
Vanmala, in your travels and among the people that you've spoken to, do you have any confidence, or how much confidence do you have, that the decision makers right now truly grasp the nature of the economic catastrophe that we are potentially sitting on right now? Do you think so?
I do think I think they grasp it. I think that we have to make a difference draw a difference between the federal government and the provincial government. I would say that today the CERB plan, put forward by Trudeau, etc., that showed Canadians in a way, and I think it was a very strong plan where it basically said, we're going to put $2,000 per month into your pocket if you have in any way been affected by this. And I think that's what Canadians wanted to hear. They just wanted to hear something along the lines of a UBI, some sort of cash in their pocket. So I think federally,
universal basic income.
Yes. I think federally, yes. Provincially, I think, sometimes in messaging, when you say things like to small businesses, like, we're going to defer your taxes for 6 months. The word defer, the fact that they still are going to have to pay it at some point, the fact that maybe frees up some liquidity for them, but doesn't give them any extra cash in the wake of this, does not really, boost confidence. For instance, I was talking to an owner of a trucking company, and he says a significant amount of his business has been wiped out because auto factories have shut down. So there's less stuff for him to move. And in that case, he's just saying, I don't want to have to lay off my drivers and rehire it, because that's a cost in itself. What I want the government to do is tell me that they're going to help subsidize the wages, because I can afford to pay some wages to these drivers. I just can't afford the full 100% of the salary. So I think that's what a lot of small businesses are calling for. But to really answer your question succinctly, I think, yes, I would say, for the most part, governments are serious about this. I think they understand the gravity of it. I just don't know if they get how long this is going to last. So I think we're going to see, much more measures roll out throughout the next year if we're in this situation where a vaccine takes maybe 12 to 18 months to be found, and we're going through these periods of, social distancing and shutdowns and reopenings, and then social distancings again, which are seeing in places like Taiwan, Singapore, and South Korea.
I guess, Daniel, one of the biggest questions that policymakers would love to know the answer to right now, and I'll get you to weigh in on this and tell us what you think. Presumably, when this thing passes, which hopefully eventually it will, the public is either they are going to be storming back to the Sky Dome or the Canadian Tire Centre, or if you're in Windsor, you're going across the border to Little Caesars Arena and go watch the Red Wings. That pent-up demand to go to sporting events, to go to concerts, to go to movies, to do all these things is either going to be there, or people are going to hunker down because the uncertainty that all this has created over the past 6 months is going to make them retrench, and the economy won't come back as quickly as everybody hopes. Do you have any guess as to which way it might go?
Yeah, that's something that a lot of market observers, economists, and other experts have started focusing on. What is the recovery going to look like? It is really hard to say. We don't have anything to go on. This is a completely unprecedented situation. What makes sense to me is that it's going to depend on how the lockdown ends, how we go about ending these restrictions and returning to normal life. If it happens too early, for example, you were discussing earlier in the program Donald Trump suggesting that maybe by Easter we ought to have the American economy running up and running again. If it happens too early and we see another outbreak, or we see another spike in cases, the next time we get that lockdown lifted, people aren't going to trust it, and people are going to stay home, and it's going to be very hard to get the economy going. And businesses too. Businesses are worried about liability. They don't want to open their doors and bring people into the office and then have somebody get sick because, you might end up with lawsuits and at the very least a bad public image. So everybody's going to be very careful. And if we're going to go, obviously at some point we're going to have to go through with ending the lockdown and returning to normal life. We need to be really careful. And as expensive as this lockdown is becoming for governments, it'll be a lot more expensive if we ended up in some kind of dysfunctional situation where we actually can't start up the economy because people won't leave their homes and businesses just won't open their doors.
Vanmala, I got about a minute left here. Can you weigh in on this issue of what the people you're interviewing and what informed speculation at this point would suggest how we're going to bounce out of this when it's all over eventually?
Yeah, I think the one factor that I haven't seen brought up a lot and we keep forgetting is that Canadians are some of the most indebted people in the first world, in the G7. And when you think about it, with the unemployment rate set to skyrocket, with a very, very high cost of living, stagnant wages, $2,000 per month only, in unemployment benefits, you will see people dip even more into debt, is what I suspect. And keep in mind, they have to continue paying consumer debt that they already have piled up, mortgage debt, that kind of stuff. So I think the recovery will be slower than we think it is because there will just be this backlog of payments and bills that people need to make if they're not getting a sufficient income. And we might even see an uptick in borrowing, which, in the short term might be okay because interest rates are low. But in the long term, the last thing this economy needs is debt ballooning out of control, because of this crisis.
Well, the answer to everything, of course, these days is we shall see. Vanmala Subramaniam and Daniel Tencer, it's good of both of you to join us on TVO tonight to help us out with this. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.